Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 13 on Elizabethan England. Now, video 13 is all about the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. There's the symbol, the crown, the sceptre. Mary was the Queen of Scotland, and yet she was executed down here in England at a place called Fotheringay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. Now, executing a monarch is a very, very unusual thing in British history. Down here in England, it's only been done twice. As I said, 8th of February 1587, Mary Queen of Scots, and then ironically her own grandson, King Charles I, 30th of January 1649, after the English Civil War. So we've only ever had two real proper executions. Sometimes kings and queens or monarchs were murdered, sometimes they died in battle. But for executions, legal executions, it only happened twice. It was a very, very unusual occurrence because something called the divine right of kings or queens. Elizabeth herself believed very, very strongly in the divine right. The monarch gets their power from God. They are legally and spiritually chosen. God is the person or the thing that's put them on the crown, given them the crown, put them on the throne. Therefore, human beings cannot go against God. And yet, it's happened twice. This video is looking at the events and the causes and indeed the consequences of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, if you remember, she arrived from Scotland 1568 asking Elizabeth for help, and she was pretty much kept within the confinements of castles for the next 19 years, almost 20 years. She was virtually kept in prison. Her arrival changed the situation down here in England and changed the situation for Elizabeth, because here was a Catholic, a potential replacement as queen for Elizabeth. Remember, Elizabeth never got married. Elizabeth never had children. Elizabeth never had any heirs. Mary was related to Elizabeth, and she therefore could be a Queen of England. And for many of the Catholics who did not accept Elizabeth's religious settlements, who did not want England to remain Protestant, Mary acted as a sort of cornerstone. Look, we can look to her, we can plot, we can plan, and we can make Mary queen. The situation was changed once Mary arrived in England. And we've seen many, many events. The revolt of the Northern Earls, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, all centred around Mary Queen of Scots as a possible replacement. Now, for 19 years or so, Elizabeth ignored the calls from her privy councillors, from her advisers like Cecil and Walsingham. She ignored their calls to execute Mary because she was her cousin, divine right of monarchs. She did not want to do it, and yet in the end she did sign the death warrant. Why would that be? Well, if you've looked at some of the other videos, the Babington plot was the final one. Remember, Walsingham had 100% conclusive evidence or proof that Mary was plotting against Elizabeth. That's one of the reasons why, in the end, Mary was executed. She'd been involved in many of the plots throughout the 20 years, but of course evidence had been a little bit sketchy. Finally, evidence was there. Also, of course, people like Walsingham, they'd introduced new laws. The Bond of Association. If you remember, the nobles had to agree to sign up to it and say, yes, we will protect Elizabeth, and if we come across anyone planning or plotting against Elizabeth, they will be executed. the bond of association makes it more of a protection for Elizabeth. 1585, after Throckmorton, a new Act of Parliament, the preservation of the Queen's safety. This was the law that Mary Queen of Scots went on trial for breaking. They said, look, you have broken this law. The penalty for that is death. Walsingham had clear evidence. We've seen that in the Babington plot. So October 1586, Mary Queen of Scots was tried and she was found guilty. Now, using these new laws, the punishment, the penalty was death. But of course, Elizabeth is still reluctant to sign the death warrant. She's still her cousin and she still believes strongly in the divine right of monarchs. 4 months, the Privy Councillors are saying to Elizabeth, look, you must do this. You must sign it for your own safety and for the good of England. 4 months, Elizabeth put them off. She'd put them off earlier. The Northern Revolt of the Earls, Ridolfi plot, Throckmorton plot. 1584, a Protestant prince, William of Orange, over in the Netherlands, had been assassinated by a Catholic. Again, increasing the pressure and the religious confrontations between Catholic and Protestant. Again, it was building and building. 1585, England actually went to war with Spain. That's a major new development, if you like. So, 1585, war with Spain. 1586, Babington plot. We have the evidence. Elizabeth really felt that I suppose she had to do it. The Privy Council was saying to Elizabeth, look, we are fearing Spain is going to launch a major invasion. We have a Catholic here who could replace you. Is it not time to remove her from the scene? January 1587, there's rumours spreading like wildfire. Oh no, Spain, a Spanish troops, Spanish army has landed in Wales. Mary Queen of Scots has escaped and she's run to the Spanish army. Now that was not true, but it shows the rumours that were around at the time and it showed people's fears. Please, Elizabeth, you must sign the death warrant. They virtually had to beg Elizabeth. In the end, Elizabeth relented, and despite the fact it was a cousin, and despite the fact it was going against all the beliefs in the divine rights of monarchs, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. But even then, she refused to send it, and it was only Walsingham and a man called William Davison, and they actually got together and William Davison took the warrant without Elizabeth's permission. When Elizabeth found out, she was furious. She didn't speak to Walsingham, one of her main advisors, for 1 month. William Davison was actually put in the Tower of London in prison for 18 months. But the warrant was delivered, and so on the 8th of February 1587, in Fotheringay Castle, Mary Queen of Scots was executed. Wow, that was a major event, the execution of a monarch appointed by God, 1587. When Elizabeth found out, she was furious, but she'd signed the death warrant. The consequences. Well, here at home, the Privy Council were right. With the removal of Elizabeth, the threat was reduced here in England. The Catholics no longer had a focus, a rallying point. That had gone. The Catholic heir to Protestant England was removed. So at home, the threat was reduced. But ironically, abroad, the threat was increased. Remember, divine right of kings. When news got to Spain and France and Catholic Europe, people's opinion, Catholic feeling was inflamed. They were outraged. The divine right of kings. These Protestants have gone against it. Dreadful behaviour. Philip became more determined to invade than he had been before. Ironically, Mary Queen of Scots, who did have a claim to the English throne, she'd said, in the event of my death, I pass on my claim to Philip of Spain. So there was an increased threat from the execution. Also, there was a worry that Mary's son, James, King James VI of Scotland, there was a worry that he might seek revenge and ally with the Catholics, even though he himself was raised as a Protestant. Now, that didn't happen, but at the time, people did fear that that would take place. So there we have the events of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, as I've said, it was a very, very unusual and strange occurrence. And even her actual death itself, killing Mary on the actual day when they did it. Here's some very unusual things that occurred. Number one, normally they get in a very, very effective and efficient executioner, and it's normally one blow of the axe. Well, according to the evidence, it needed 3 strikes, 3 blows with the axe. Obviously, the person hadn't actually got it correct. Okay, so maybe instead of using that axe, they should have used that one. Wow, that's a beast. But it took 3 blows of the axe to actually finish the job. That's one strange thing. The next thing, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, he's got a rather nice hair dye on. But I haven't. Unbelievably, it's a wig. And when the executioner lifted Mary's head to show, which they normally did, it was a wig. And the head fell underneath. That's the second rather strange thing to happen. And then, according to some evidence, a third strange thing to happen was that after the execution, from underneath Mary's rather big dress, outran her dog, a little Skye Terrier. So 3 bizarre things that happened at this hugely important event. The axe, the wig, and the dog. Strange part of the story there. Now, what might they decide to ask you in an exam? Well, they could ask you a judgment question. Now, they're the ones with the most marks. They could say something like, they give you a statement. The Babington plot was the main cause of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. How far do you agree? Well, the Babington plot was the final plot, so you'd have to write and say, yes, that did play a big part. But you could also write about other factors, Walsingham and him getting the evidence. Or you could write about the Spanish War, 1585, which increased the pressure between Spain and England, and maybe that persuaded Elizabeth she had to act and sign the death warrants. Or you could mention maybe these new laws, the Bond of Association, or the 1585, preservation of the Queen's safety. So you can mention various things there and say, look, they all played a part in the final decision to execute Mary Queen of Scots, and give your judgment about which one you think was the most important. Or another one. Here's another judgment question. Lack of foreign support was the main reason why the Catholic plots failed. How far do you agree with that? Well, yes, it's one of the reasons. Philip of Spain often promised help, particularly financial, but it never ever really materialized. He didn't send money. He didn't send Spanish troops. The French under the Duke of Guise, yes, they were sort of organising an army, but it never came. So you can argue that the foreigners, the Spanish, the French, did not actually give total support, which led to the collapse of the Catholic plots. You can argue that. However, you can also argue the effectiveness of Elizabeth's spies, Walsingham, Cecil, the fact that they seemed to know about the plots as they were going on. Or you could argue that many of the Catholics didn't support the plots because they were quite happy with the religious settlement. So again, talk about various different elements of the story and show how they actually caused the plots to fail, and then give your judgment about what you think is the most important factor. So, I hope it's been useful. The execution of a monarch, a very, very rare event. Now, one of the characters I've mentioned quite a bit in this video is Walsingham, Francis Walsingham. Now, he played a huge part in discovering the evidence and trying to persuade Elizabeth to actually sign the death warrant. He was the one in the end who she wouldn't even talk to for a month. She was so annoyed with him. I'm sure he lived with that because he got what he wanted, the removal of Mary Queen of Scots. But in the next video, I'll examine Francis Walsingham in a bit more detail so that you get a good idea of what he's actually doing, his role, his effectiveness, in case they ask a question on him in the exam. So, Walsingham's coming next. Hope it's been useful. It's a tale of two axes. Wow. So, I'll speak to you soon. Take care now. All the best.